what can you say about the figure? Because Nigerians are really many Nigerians, let me put it that way, they are really not believing those figures. What do you have to say about the figures?
Well, the figures are what they are, right? Whether they are accurate or not, it's maybe I'll share my perspective around it. But first of all, like I mentioned earlier, the country has recognized methods of making a confirmatory diagnosis of COVID-19. So meaning that before a case is reported officially and formally, then such a diagnosis would have been made using such methods, and which I mentioned earlier. And so what that invariably means is that you have to necessarily test people before you can make a diagnosis. And in principle, the more people you test, the more people you are likely to find. We do know that it's possible to make testing very targeted so that you can increase the yield. But currently, we do know that the country, as of today, which is the 2nd of August, the country has done cumulatively about 283,000 COVID-19 tests, which some people consider, really on the low side, if you take into account that this condition has been with us now for almost 6 months. And also, if you take into account the fact that the country has a population of 200 million people, and virtually every state is affected.
The ratio is very
so we're looking at a situation where, out of 200 million, we've only tested 280 something thousand, which is, maybe one test for every 1,000 persons, which is really, really very low. But however, this number of tests has yielded, as of today, about 43,500 cases cumulatively over time, and which gives a positivity rate of about 15%. That means that 15 out of every 100 persons tested has turned out to be positive, which is quite high, which is really quite high, and also which probably suggests that if we had found a way of testing many more people, I know at some point NCDC announced an ambitious plan to test 2 million people over a 3-month period, which would have been quite remarkable if we found a way of achieving that. So imagine if we did that over a 3-month period, in the last 3 months, for example, and we had a positivity rate of 15% or even 10%, then we probably would have a case count through that approach of over 200,000. So yes, there are concerns that we probably are not testing enough, and that the figures, yes, quite high, but maybe if we are tested more, we probably would have officially higher figures of people with COVID-19. But that is for the government to resolve, to find a way of ramping up testing, so that we can have close to accurate estimates of the real prevalence of the condition. But it's also important to note that since we are talking about the statistics, that out of the about 43,500 people who have cumulative tested positive so far, about 20,000 of these have been successfully managed and discharged and literally declared free of COVID-19, while you have about 22,000 something that are still active cases. And it's also important to note that Lagos State has been the epicenter and accounts for almost 40% of the total number of cases in the country. But also interestingly, Lagos State has conducted more than 40% of the total number of tests. So there's a correlation between testing and cases. So if you test more, you are likely to find more. So that's a principle that's really very important. That we actually need to do more. The hallmark, of the response is your ability to rapidly test, detect, isolate, and treat. If we're able to do that in a very proficient manner and we're able to do it at scale, then we will increase our chances of being able to manage the condition and being able to eventually defeat and beat the virus.
Doctor.
So I'm sorry to now, just before you go. We also do know that the country has also recorded, over 800 deaths as cumulatively over the period as of today, which is again on the high side, but there's a belief out there that if we are not testing enough, then there probably may have been COVID-19 related mortality in some people who were not tested. And as such deaths could not be attributed to COVID-19. So there's a perception that the actual mortality may be a lot higher. And just to conclude on this, recently a study was done by the Center for Disease Control in the US, an antibody test. I mentioned antibody, which is able to tell if somebody may have had the infection, whether or not they knew about it. And this study showed that I think it was in New York and some other places, that for potentially for every reported case of COVID-19, there may be up to 10 cases that go unreported. And if you consider that the US has done more tests than any country in the world, the US, as of today, has done over 50 million tests. Has done almost 50 million tests and found more than, about 4.5 million cases or thereabouts, compared to Nigeria that has done just 280 something thousand tests. So if in a country like the US that has done so many tests but still believe that they are not testing enough, still believe that for every one case, there's about 10 that goes undetected. So there is a chance that a similar picture is playing out in other places, or even worse, especially in countries that are not testing enough. So the figures are what they are. They are accurate in the sense that they are a reflection of the effort so far. So the question is that, is there a lot more beyond that based on the effort that has not carried out, based on the fact that we're not testing enough? Is there a chance that there might be in reality many more cases and many more deaths? And I strongly believe that is likely to be the case.
So now, do we have a vaccine, and what is the hope of getting a vaccine very soon? Because what we are waiting for now is a vaccine.
Yes.
And
okay, so let me start by saying that vaccine development processes are really, really very complex. Very, very complex. And vaccines for viruses especially are even more complex compared to some bacterial conditions. We do know that HIV, for example, has been around for close to that's 1981. This is close to 40 years.
And no cure yet.
And there's no vaccine yet, despite all the research. Ebola, which had been around for far longer, over 40 years as well, it's only recently that we can say that there's a vaccine. And even that is still undergoing evaluation and all of that. There are some vaccines for example, influenza, which has similar symptoms as COVID-19. Vaccines have been successfully developed for it, and it's quite challenging because of the constantly mutating nature of the influenza virus. But for COVID-19, it's important to note that no disease condition in the history of humanity has received as much attention and as much funding for vaccine development as much as COVID-19. Billions of dollars have been spent already and are being spent just because of the nature of the condition and the potential threat it has on human existence, both health-wise and also on the economy as well, and how it has disrupted our lives and making it almost impossible to experience life as normal as we used to know it in the past. So it's interesting to note that there are, probably over 200 different vaccine development efforts around the world, and up to 20 of those are showing sign of of promise.
Okay.
Having scaled through different phases. There's phase 1, there's phase 2, then there's human trials
Okay.
at a low scale, then there's a large scale human trial before you can conclude the vaccine development process. Typically, vaccine development lasts up to 5 years at the minimum. But do we have 5 years to wait for COVID-19 vaccine? No, we don't. The world is in a race to get one, and it's important to announce that at least 3 countries: the US, China, Russia, and the UK, as well as Germany. At least 5 countries have announced at least one vaccine candidate
Okay.
that has really reached advanced stages of clinical trials
Okay.
and have commenced human trials. Some have completed phase 1 of the human trials
Okay.
and going into phase 2, and preliminary reports from the researchers behind this suggests some promising outcomes from the trials that have been conducted so far. And it is believed that further evaluation and testing will be required before we can come to that point where we believe that we have a safe vaccine that can be developed at scale. Several dates have been touted. Some people have said that before the end of the summer,
Okay.
which is around September, October. People have advanced that as a time when perhaps maybe some of the trials will be concluded.
Okay.
Some people have said maybe sometime early next year.
Okay.
But it's also important to note that having a vaccine that has been successfully tried is one thing. Being able to produce it in enough quantities and to administer it to as many people who need it around the world is something else entirely. The world population is over 7 billion.
Yeah.
And what that means is that if you were to, even if we had the technology to develop and be able to administer a vaccine, to develop, let's say for example, 10 million doses of a vaccine every day, right? It will take several years before you can produce enough quantities to go around everybody, administer enough quantities to go around everybody. So on the one hand, it's good to know that the vaccine development process is progressing, but on the other hand, we need to be cautiously optimistic over the eventual outcome of the vaccine development process on the one hand, and also over the reality of how extremely difficult it will be, to produce sufficient quantities that could go around everywhere. And for those of us in the third world, we also have this added layer of having to wait until it is our turn, because I want to believe that the rich nations and the nations who are behind this research will prioritize their population.
Okay.
In the first set of the vaccines that are developed, and it's likely to come at a huge cost that might be very difficult for a lot of countries.
So that point now you just made, actually brought something to my mind now. Like, is there anything political about the vaccine itself? Because I was discussing with doctor yesterday in Aircom, and he was telling me that the possibility of the country that developed the virus becoming the next world power is there. So I don't know what you have to say about
of
that.
Course,
because it's like a gold mine.
Yes, it is. It is. There's been an ongoing scientific race, and don't forget, very recently there was this war over 5G and who was going to take the credits and glory for developing and advancing 5G technology because of the potential. So there's like a tech war generally between